Becki Hawkins is a hospice nurse and a chaplain. She is the author of Transitions, A Nurse's Education About Life and Death. She sat beside the bedside of seriously ill and terminally ill patients for more than 30 years as an oncology and hospice nurse. During that time, she listened to patients describe various kinds of spiritual experiences, including near-death experiences. Becki will be sharing these stories, including the lessons she learned from them tonight. So please welcome Becki.
Thank you, David. I'm thrilled to be here. It's such a gift. When he was talking earlier about how, how did you find us, and how did you connect, it just reminds you that there's so much more going on than meets the eye about how these supposedly coincidences happen. Actually, I think there's much more behind that. Let me just share with you a little bit about me. I do want to thank David for this opportunity to be here. I did email him and just happened to say I thought maybe I could just meet him while I was here in Sedona visiting my precious friend Dorothy. And he sent an email right back and said, could you speak? So this is just another one of those things that just worked out, and I'm just really tickled to be here and be with you. My first exposure to nursing was when I was 19 years old, looking for a job 6 weeks after the birth of our daughter. The only job available in the newspaper ads was as a nurse's aide in a nursing home. Why not? I thought, let's go try it. It was the hardest, least paying job I've ever had in my life, and I fell in love with it. I fell in love with those patients and the stories that they were sharing with me, and it was my first exposure to seeing people die. That was when and where I decided that I wanted to go to nursing school someday. Didn't have any money. It took me 7 years before I could get to go to nursing school to become a registered nurse. I graduated in 1980, and my first job was at a big hospital in Tulsa, Oklahoma, on their brand new oncology ward. Again, I fell in love with the patients and their families. It was very, very hard work, and I couldn't believe at first I was getting paid, but that wore off. Over the years, I worked with oncology patients, outpatient oncology, hospice, home health hospice. I took 2 years of training and became a hospice chaplain and a hospice volunteer, and now I'm retired and I just visit people. Early in my career, while I was working on that oncology ward one evening, I lost 3 patients. When I got home, I was trying to tell my husband about it. There were so many emotions that I was trying to deal with. I didn't know quite what to do. He said, why don't you write that down? Because I don't think I want to hear all that stuff. He said, and maybe it'll help you with your emotions. He said, just write that down. So early on, I started writing. I visited our local newspaper office, talked to the editor, and said, what do you think? Could someone else use some of this information? And he goes, yeah. He said, can you write one every week? And I said, sure. My first article was in May of 1986, and I write one every week to this day. Now I have 30 years of these memories in my office at home. So I turned 60 last year, and my husband said, maybe you ought to write a book before you forget how to do that. He's always good for ideas. And I said, well, I don't know how a person could go to a Tom Bird seminar and write a book in 5 days. And he said, you're not going to know till you go and find out. And I did. I wrote my book in 5 days because what he told us was bring it up from your heart, not just from your head, and it will come, and you can birth that book. Dying people can teach us so much about life. What we have to do is be present to them and listen to them and hear their stories and the stories of those who have near-death experiences. Perhaps some of you can even relate to that. I was fascinated with the near-death experience stories of those first books that David was talking about when they were coming out by Dr. Raymond Moody, Dan M. Brinkley, Betty Eady, and I can remember reading them without stopping. I could not put it down. I wanted to keep reading and hear more and more. Why? These stories and those books gave me new hope, an added hope to my faith, because I had been at so many bedsides where sometimes some of these people did not have hope and were very, very frightened about the thought of dying. Where was I escorting them to? Because I have shared with many people that I feel like a midwife to the other side. I'm not pushing, I'm not forcing, but being present to them in that process. And I count it a huge honor because it's the holiest ground I've ever stood on, being with these people. And just like David mentioned earlier too, they come from all backgrounds, all faiths. Some were Amish, some were Catholic, some were agnostic, some were Baptist. And as I say in my book, where was I helping them go to? Really. When working with those in the nursing home in 1971, I was 19, uneducated, inexperienced, and horrified each time I lost a patient, and would cry. They would find me in the mop closet. Becki, you can come out now. And I got to the point, though, that I didn't run from death anymore, but I ran toward it. When I was working in a psychiatric ward as a nurse's student 7 years later, I took care of a gentleman one day who was diagnosed as manic depressive back then. He had lung cancer, and he was scheduled to have surgery the next day to see if they could remove some of the tumors. He was wild. He was so funny. He looked like Willie Nelson. He had long hair, pulled back, thin, rough, tough looking, and ranting and raving and running up and down the hallway screaming, "Praise God, glory be to God, I'm going to heaven tomorrow. Give Oral Roberts all your money." And just back and forth. He was just all over the place, just carrying on. And they said, "We want you to go trim his toenails." I said, "What?" "I don't even know if I can catch his toes." They said, "Well, we want you to go in there because he needs to have that done before he goes to surgery." I said, "I'm getting ready to graduate from nursing school. You want me to go trim somebody's toenails?" And they said, "Yeah, we do." Well, you learn a lot when you learn to be humble. So I talked the little fella into calming down just a little bit, got him in the chair, got the stuff that I needed, sudged up his feet. He's still ranting and raving. He's still praising God and wanting everybody to give their money to Oral Roberts. And I'm soaping him up. This was the old days, the long wards where the beds were lined up. VA hospital. Different ones, different diagnosis. I'm taking care of him, and in walks one of his buddies who is a paranoid schizophrenic. And my patient says to him, "Hey, where you been? What have you been doing? What are you going? What's going on? What's happening?" They don't want you to ask them that stuff. And so he walks over to my patient, hits him right between the eyes, right here. It wasn't funny, but at the time, blood is going everywhere. I got under the first bed I could find, and I started screaming, "Help!" For the orderlies to come and get me and come and rescue me, because I thought, I'm going to die here trying to trim somebody's toenails. This isn't pretty. This isn't what I was planning on. Well, my little patient is screaming too. He's carrying on, and just screaming for help. And the orderlies come in and they get the poor little confused guy and take him off. And my patient's sitting there, and he goes, "Well, thanks be to God. The little nurse was screaming and saved my life. Glory be to God. Give all your money to Oral Roberts." So my supervisor walks in and she goes, "Becki, you can come out now." So I crawled out from under the bed and sat with my patient and visited with him some more. When I got back to the hospital room where we were having our little nurses meeting, my supervisor said to me, "Did you learn anything today?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I did." She said, "Okay." I said, "Can I go early tomorrow morning and pray with him before he has surgery? I think he's kind of into prayer." And she said, "Yes, get permission and you can go." So I went, and he'd had his medication, and he was calmed down a little bit. And I said a prayer with him and went to do my work and came back after his surgery to go to ICU and check on him. I couldn't find him. And so I went to the nurse's desk and I told them who I was looking for, and they said, "Sweetheart, he died in surgery." He wasn't crazy. He knew what he was hearing. One evening at a fundraiser dinner in our local community, a very kind lady pulled me aside and said, "Say, Becki, I've been reading your stories in the newspaper, and you had one about a near-death experience the other day, and I had one when I was 4 years old. Will you call me so we can get together and talk about it?" So I did, and I went to her home and visited with her. We sat down at her kitchen table. Beautiful woman in her 70s, very strong, very positive, very precious. She said, "Well, I was 4 years old and I had polio. I was in the hospital in the children's ward, hospital in Tulsa. There again, many, many, many years ago, the beds were lined up." She said there were little white metal beds lined up. She said, "I was in so much pain. I didn't think I could stand it." And her father was at her bedside with her, and she saw the nuns and watched them going up and down the hallways to take care of the children. She was in such terrible pain, and all of a sudden she said she was out of her little body and raising above it and watching her dad try to, get her going again. He was concerned. He could tell she wasn't breathing anymore. And she said, "Becki, I was in the most beautiful place." She said it was all light and it was bright, and I was surrounded like it was a cocoon of warmth, and I was not hurting anymore. There was no more pain. And she said, "I saw the nuns come from the other end of the hall, rushing towards my body." She said, "I was filled with such indescribable love. I cannot find a word to tell you what it was like. There was so much peace. But I could see my father's anguish at the thought of losing me. And all of a sudden, I was back in my body with all the horrible pain. And I tried to tell him, 'Dad, I died.' And he said, 'Shh, don't tell anyone that. That was just a dream.' Years and years later, when these first books started coming out, she read them. And she said, 'At that point I knew it was not a dream, just as I had thought. It was real.' When I was working in hospice, a spouse of one of my patients called our office to ask that I come over right away. He was a very precious elderly man, white shock of hair, a little Pentecostal minister. His wife was his second wife. The first one had passed years before, and this wife had been one of his parishioners. And she felt like it was improper to call him by his name, first name. So she called him Brother Talbert. So Brother Talbert was sitting in a blue recliner, and he was bluer than his recliner when I got there. She did not do well with this whole scenario. Her safety net was pulling her apron up and running to the kitchen, and that's exactly what she did. She ran back in there. He said, "She'll be okay." But he said, "Can you get me to my bed?" And I said, "Yes." And I literally picked the little fella up, and I carried him to his bed, hospital bed, that was there in the living room by a big picture window, and outside of that was what he liked to look at. His parsonage, there's, the church, and then the tree that was about, 200 or 300 years old out there. He loved those things very much. So I straddled him. I got in behind him, and I had him sitting straight up. He was agonal, and his breathing was very labored and very short. He could not get air. So he felt better if I held him up very straight. And I had my fingertips on his shoulders. And he patted me. And he said, Becki, do you see them? And I said, no. But tell me what you're seeing, because I'd had too many people tell me. He said, sweetheart, the room is full of angels now. He said, they're all over. They're over here on this side, and they're over here on this side. He said, they're all over. He said, Annie, I have to go. I love you. I'll see you again. And he held up his right arm, and he said, my Lord. And he fell back against me on my chest. This man was on no pain medicine. It was his heart and his lungs that were damaged from chemo and radiation in the 70s, which was caustic, even more so than now. That's what he was dying from. Was he hallucinating? Not in my books. I believe that man. He gave me another new hope that made me understand how indeed holy that ground is when we are with those loved ones that are transitioning and that veil is parted. One day I was assigned to go see a lady who had been admitted into